I'm so thrilled to have brought together this panel because I've been wanting for a long time to bring together a bunch of groups that don't always identify themselves as journalists, but who are doing very similar work in our digital age of trying to use the latest techniques and of our automated and computational age to do evidence gathering and to do accountability work. And sometimes, in my case, we call that journalism, and sometimes in Brian's case, we call it human rights work. And so I thought it'd be really great to bring disparate groups together to talk about all the different ways that we use these techniques to do journalism and accountability work. So I'm going to start a little bit by just saying who I am, why I'm here, what I do, and then have each of our panelists, including, I think Marta is on Zoom, so hopefully we'll bring her up when it's her turn. Hello, Marta. And so each one of them will talk about what they do, and then we'll start a discussion. And one thing I'd like to do, since we're not supposed to take questions, is if you have questions, tweet them at me, at Julia Angwin on Twitter, and I'll keep looking, because I do want to see if there are some, if we have a moment to address the kind of questions people have, because I have an image in my mind of what I think is interesting, but it might not be the same as what you all think is interesting. So let me start with just who I am. I'm Julia Angwin. I'm the founder of the Markup. It's a nonprofit newsroom in New York. We do investigative journalism about the impact of technology on society. And one of the defining characteristics of our newsroom is that it is half programmers and half journalists, and we use computational automation techniques to do big data analyses that form the foundation of our investigations. And so we're a newsroom that really sometimes you could consider a forensic digital reporting lab. Although we don't call ourselves that, I think that we have a lot of aspects in common with that. And so, for example, just to give one example of the types of things that we do, we did a big data analysis of predictive policing software that is used across the world, and compared where they sent the police to patrol with census data about what those neighborhoods were like, and saw that, unfortunately to no one's surprise, this software was basically only sending police to black and brown neighborhoods and not to white neighborhoods. This was something people had long suspected, but it took an analysis of 7 million predictive policing data points, which they left unsecured on the internet, which we found, to really prove that point. And that's the kind of work that I'm talking about here, where you use, we had to use a different statistical analysis and big data and joining different data and cleaning the data to make sure we removed outliers. And that kind of work, I think, is more and more the work of accountability. So I want to turn first to Marta, who's joining us from New York, I believe, and she is the head of consumer reports, and they have stood up a digital lab that I think is, hopefully you all will be really excited to hear about, and so I'm going to hand it over to Marta to tell us about her work.
Hi, Julia. I wish I was with you all enjoying that beautiful environment, but I am in a room in New York. And I really appreciate you bringing this group together, because you're right. Consumer Reports is not the organization you think of when you're gathering journalists to talk about issues of forensic and digital and data-rich reporting. But the reality is that we've been around since 1930. We're one of the largest consumer rights organizations in the globe, and we have over 6 million members that read our journalism religiously, and they do that for a whole host of reasons, either because they're looking for products that are safe and effective, or the marketplace is getting more and more complex and they're trying to make sense of it. Similar to a lot of what Julia talked about, we are science-based, evidence-driven, and we rely so much on data to inform the mission-driven work we do. And we like to say that what we do is about really revealing the truth so that we can grow consumer power and hold both government and corporations accountable. Unlike some journalistic enterprises, though, we have over 60 labs and technicians. We also do a lot of statistical analysis and survey millions of people every year. And that really fuels our investigative journalism as well. And so we try to use that evidence-based work to help individual consumers, but again, to try to create standards, transparency, and fairness in the marketplace. And just as you said, Julia, and the marketplace is only growing more complex. Platforms are less transparent. And what does that do? That creates a power imbalance. And some of our reporting is really in service to that. The reason we created the Digital Lab is because in the world of analog products and services, which we review, it doesn't translate automatically when products are connected, when they're also scooping up data, when you're more vulnerable, but you can't necessarily understand or see the vulnerabilities. So how do you begin to ask questions about an algorithm, whether it's deceiving or discriminating? How is a credit score app, which really is the key to your financial future, being calculated? How do you hold these companies accountable? So in addition to products that we test for security, transparency, and privacy, we also partner with other journalistic enterprises to be able to sort of join our lab work and our research and our reporting with other organizations. So I'll just give you two quick examples of that. And one of the examples is something as basic as tap water, where we partnered with The Guardian. And what we did there was we started using crowdsourcing techniques to distribute testing kits to over 120 volunteers across the country to test their tap water. And of course, we found that they were above and beyond some limits for chemicals that we know to be harmful. We take that data and we create change, and we did the same in an investigation we did with ProPublica that Julie was involved in, where we looked at something like car insurance, which is not optional in the US. To drive a car, you have to have insurance. And so how is the pricing determined in that insurance? And what we found is, of course, rather than it being related to your driving history, it's more related to the color of your skin, the neighborhood you live in, and who else lives in that neighborhood. So you start to see the impacts. And so how do you hold companies and government accountable? Because in fact, so many of the victories that we had in the analog world that are checks and balances on the marketplace, as well as on either overreaching or underreaching by government regulation, don't apply fully to the digital world. And so that really, it was about building the capabilities we needed in a very complex and growing marketplace that, as you say, is not transparent, but also creating opportunities to partner with other journalistic enterprises that are trying to forge a path in this area. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, the work that Consumer Reports doing is so amazing. I mean, I don't know if all of you are familiar with their work, but they test every car, every washing machine, and they have these incredible standards. And yet, as Marta said, that when you buy a router for your home, you don't know really. It's not easy to test it in that sort of way. And so they came up with all these standards for like, how should you test a router and what kind of privacy invading features are in it and which ones actually have security bugs. And it's really important work. I want to next turn to Brian, who's at Human Rights Watch, and he is a head of a lab there that is using forensic techniques for human rights work.
Great, thanks, Julia. It's really a pleasure to be here. Human Rights Watch, should I explain it? It's a human rights advocacy organization. It's we don't think about ourselves as journalists, but I mean, it's a no-brainer to me that we're here because what we're trying to do is get at the truth, just like Marta explained that they're doing at Consumer Reports. So, Human Rights Watch is about 570 people, 130 research staff all around the world. And so the tagline for the methodology is investigate, expose, change. So, deep research into human rights abuses, publishing our findings, and then using that work to conduct advocacy with governments and others in power. So I'm the senior quantitative analyst. I'm a part of a team called the Digital Investigations Lab. It's a small team. We have about 4 people, soon to be 6 people. And I think the goal of our team is basically to expand the methodological toolbox for investigating human rights abuses. So what I mean by that is, like, the tools I'm talking about are not actual software or anything, but methodological tools. So quantitative analysis of data, data we get through freedom of information requests, through open records, scraping, sometimes surveys. It's open source intelligence work with photo and video evidence. It's geospatial imagery. We have a geospatial analyst who looks at satellite imagery. It's using engineered tools like Blacklight, which Julia's team developed to investigate technology. But at the heart of research is always fundamentally, it's interviews and testimony. And so, that always provides the contextual understanding and is like the heart of how we research. And so the lab is always working in collaboration with other researchers. We're never kind of just putting out a piece that's just data or just open source intelligence. And so the kind of things that guide our work, we're guided by that collaboration with researchers to identify kind of what we're going to be researching and where our methodological tools are most needed. We're only four to five people, so we don't have always all of the skills or tools that we need on our teams. So partnerships really feed into how we do our work. The lab part of our name is something that I think we actually need to work on quite a bit to find the space to be able to experiment. I mean, that's what a lab means to me. It's been difficult to find the space to do that. There's always more work to be done. So we really need to carve out opportunities to do that. The things that kind of, the way that we think about our work is to use any of these methods ethically, with security in mind, with trauma-informed mentality in mind as we're looking at photos and videos, to always be considering bias in the quality of data. And I think we'll get into it a bit more, to have a substantive review process to make sure that, that we're right. I want to talk a little bit about why we have the lab. Basically, this used to be kind of on the periphery of human rights research, but it's now become absolutely fundamental to how Human Rights Watch works. The reason why we need these tools, these methodologies, is that there's a lot that we work on that cannot be understood just by testimony, right? What we bring in by doing all of these analyses is that we're able to identify and prove patterns of abuse. We're able to look at not just individual violations, but systemic violations. We're able to show scope, how many people are affected. We're able to show comparisons over geography or over time. We're able to compare groups. Some of the basic work that I do is always just looking at disparities and inequality between different groups. It's necessary to have the ability to cross-corroborate like what we're hearing. Anything that we put out, all of these different methods are used to kind of complement each other and present a well-rounded, fuller picture. And the fact is that like photo and video evidence exists. So if we're not looking at it and not using it, we're not actually getting the complete picture if we're just relying on victim testimony and witness testimony. And of course, there are places that we cannot send researchers right now. So sometimes we don't have physical access, so we have to look from space to look at the evidence that's uploaded all day, every day, and use that to investigate. And then finally, when we're investigating human rights abuses caused by technology, we really need to use technology in order to gather evidence about that technology. So those are the kind of the main buckets of why we have to have these labs in human rights work.
Great, thank you, Brian. It's like, I always say that's about journalism too. It's like you said about trying to prove the systemic and not just the anecdotal. One of the things I think is important about this accountability work is that, you know, we can increase the sample size, right? Journalism, previously, in most of my career as a journalist, I really was limited to the number of people that I physically could speak to, right? And that would be the sample size for my data set. And so being able to collect data at scale allows you to be more confident in your conclusions. I'm going to go now to Logan, who is at Bellingcat, which I think you could describe as a lab, or you're part of the lab. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bellingcat, but they are doing incredible work in war zones right now in Ukraine and made their name in Syria, identifying weapons and war crimes. And so let Logan take it from here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Logan Williams. I'm a senior data scientist on Bellingcat's investigative technology team. And Bellingcat is a nonprofit, independent media organization that's been around since 2014 to do investigations using open source investigative techniques. So these are investigations that are based on material that's been gathered from publicly available evidence, be that satellite imagery, like Brian mentioned, social media posts, or public records, like business filings and that sort of information. So some of the projects that we're working on right now, as Julia mentioned, is tracking the immense amount of social media information coming from Ukraine to look at instances of civilian harm where we can find an image and verify exactly when and where it took place using techniques like geolocation, where you look, for instance, for recognizable buildings or landmarks in an image, cross-reference that with satellite imagery, and are able to establish the precise location that something happened without necessarily having someone on the ground taking that photo. We divide our work into three kind of main branches. One focused on investigations and publishing the results of what we've done. For instance, last year, based on data that was collected by one of our researchers from phone records in Russia, we were able to find exactly who the Russian state security agents were that had been trailing Alexei Navalny and implicate them in his poisoning. And that was published as an investigation. We also work on justice and accountability efforts. For example, after the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in 2014, by looking at social media posts from Russian social media accounts, especially dashcam footage from people driving across Russia, our researchers were able to identify the missile launcher that was used to down the airplane and track it as it traveled all the way from Russia into the Donbass in Ukraine. And this information was then used in the European Court for Human Rights as part of a legal investigation against Russia. And then the third area that we really focus on is training. A lot of these techniques, like geolocation or chronolocation, where you use information like shadows or the weather in an image to identify not only what time of day it was taken, but potentially even what time of year it was taken, are techniques that didn't necessarily exist before we started in 2014. And part of our mission is to make sure that these techniques can be used not only within Bellingcat itself, but in newsrooms and investigative organizations around the world. So we run trainings all the time to teach other organizations and other people how to apply these techniques to their own work. As Julia mentioned, we, as an organization, kind of operate collectively as a lab. Most of us are not journalists by training. I am not a journalist by training. But we're able to bring our diverse skill sets and our willingness to experiment with new techniques to develop these methods, try them out, see what we can find with an investigation, and publish the results or teach the methods to other organizations.
Awesome, thank you. I forgot to mention the Navalny investigation, which was incredible, right? And allowed, one of the most amazing moments of all time was when he called the guy who had poisoned him and pretended to be his boss. Is that right?
Yeah, it was amazing. Christo Grozev, our lead investigator who was working with Alexei Navalny to, after he had independently discovered all of this evidence, brought it to Navalny to discuss. Navalny called up some of these people using the phone numbers that were gotten from the phone records, and by impersonating a superior military officer, was able to get one of these FSB security agents to discuss details of the poisoning that weren't at that point known, and therefore validate that they were involved in the poisoning and learn a little bit more about how their methods work for doing these sorts of chemical attacks.
I mean, truly some of the greatest undercover work of all time. And also a real testimony to the topic that I want to discuss next, which is one of the things about that investigation was that it was enabled by the fact that you guys were able to buy on, I guess, the Russian black market, a bunch of phone records about different how phone numbers move around. As you probably all know, that there's basically a market of companies that collect all this data about phones and where they're moving and sell them. And of course, this is incredibly privacy violating, this market, and it's something that is a tension, I think, in the work that maybe we all do, which is sometimes when you're trying to collect data, you are invading people's privacy. And so I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Logan, but I first want to just say a little bit about what we do at the Markup on those situations, because we are a unique newsroom in that we are not, we have made a privacy promise to our readers. We do not track them at all. So we do not have any cookies on our website. When you come, it loads really fast, and we don't have any third-party cookies, and we go to great lengths, sort of annoying lengths, to make sure that's true. So we can't embed YouTube videos. We have to build our own little video embed system. We can't embed tweets because all the tools out there for those types of things contain tracking technology. But that said, we have built a project called Citizen Browser, where we have paid a whole bunch of volunteers to install some software we built, and it allows us to see their Facebook feeds and pull down all the information from their feed and analyze it. It's part of a project to keep Facebook accountable for its promises. The TLDR is that I think we found them violating at least a dozen of their promises so far in a year and change of monitoring their feeds. But we have to go to great lengths to protect the privacy of the people who are participating in this project, because even though we pay them, it's still not right to take their data, read their chats with their grandma, all the things that they're doing on Facebook. So we have built an enormous system that basically redacts all of the personally identifiable data, and so that we as humans actually cannot even retrieve it. Once we get it, it only has basically publicly available things like a news link or groups that are public, and we can't see anything personal. But that costs an enormous amount of money, it makes our work a lot harder, and it's a big trade-off. And so I'd love to hear from the other panelists about the privacy trade-offs that they've had to make, and I do want to remind you all that you can also tweet questions to me at Julia Angwin. I don't know, do you want to go first, Logan, on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. When we do open source investigations, especially when we're using data from social media or data from these black market data sources, it contains an immense amount of personal information on people that are not necessarily implicated in anything that we're investigating. So at Bellingcat, we really focus on trying to make our methods as transparent as possible so that people can see exactly how we arrived at a conclusion, while also not releasing so much information that we're, for instance, jeopardizing the safety of someone that posted a video of a chemical attack in Syria or something like that. So that means that essentially whenever we discuss our methods openly or publish an investigation that it contains our methods, we have to do that editorial trade-off of how do we balance this need for privacy versus the need to be transparent. Another thing that we're focused or trying to balance at the moment is, for instance, when we collect information from users, for instance, if we're crowdsourcing images, we want to encourage those users to communicate with us through encrypted messaging apps like Signal. We want to make sure that they know that metadata contained in their image might contain information that they don't necessarily want to reveal. But at the same time, when we find information on social media and we use it, that metadata can be a gold mine for our investigation. So as we encourage people to be more privacy conscious, we're also potentially removing investigative leads that might be useful in the future.
It's a difficult tension. I want to bring in Marta because I know that they at Consumer Reports actually ask their members to share a lot of information, like I believe some of their utility bills, maybe even healthcare bills, in order to help do analysis. And I know there are some privacy trade-offs they've had to make there as well.
Yeah, I mean, great question. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so that's why I'm halting a bit.
We can hear you.
So let me focus and see if I can get through some of the tech issues. But I think every organization that handles personal data has to be a trustworthy steward, and that sort of really doubles down on the public interest research that we do and working with our members. One of the things, and then imagine we also run a social enterprise, a business where we want to personalize and maximize the experience of all our 6 million members, which means, you know, how do we feel about collecting data about what their preferences are, and how can we really think about being a model social enterprise that is more transparent about what we do and engages our members on those privacy issues. So a number of private sector organizations have created a position of a chief privacy officer. And we did the same thing. We have a chief privacy officer that really kind of turns the mirror on us as an organization and says, oh, wait a minute, how are we respecting the privacy of our staff, our members, and our partners? And so that's been something new. And as you say, Julia, some of the investigations we conduct are in industries that are notorious for not being transparent and for using that lack of transparency in pricing to gouge consumers, to take advantage of consumers, to discriminate against consumers on pricing. And so we do. We crowdsource. We ask them, would you send us your bill? Because there is no other way for us to gauge pricing. And we have been able to develop that kind of trust that we get a lot of response from that. But then we have to steward that data as well. So I think it's yet another capability that we have as an organization that has millions of members. How are we doing that investigation? How are we securing that data? And what kind of new protocols do we instill in that as well? And I'll just give you one more example on the digital lab. So one of the California, the very large state in the US that has tremendous potential for us to pilot a variety of things, has passed a California Consumer Protection Act that, you as a resident of California can actually minimize data collection and informed consent on some of the engagements you have. So we decided to put the law to a test, and to do that, again, we had a survey and we engaged our members and our consumers to try to do, in fact, what the law says it's supposed to do, to say, is this actually effective and efficacious? So we collected all that data, and that data, of course, creates the insights we need to take it to a government agency and say, maybe this works on paper, but our members say it doesn't. And so then we have to scrub that data again for the personal identifiable information. So I think it's hard to do. I don't think it's impossible. We are learning and we are creating new protocols as we do that. And like the other partners at the days today, we in the past were not very quote unquote open source. It was a bit of a black box where we had testing methodologies, we did it a certain way. But that's why, I referenced what you talked about earlier, which was an open source digital standard. Like, what are the standards that we can put in place around privacy and security to hold others accountable? And so we created this thing called a digital standard. It's open source. We have a lot of other security organizations and watchdogs contributing to that. And that, in a sense, is a tool to incentivize exactly this kind of behavior, where we are having to build trust, and in the way in which we not only model, we have to model the way in which we are also advocating for the kind of security and privacy for government actors as well as manufacturers.
Thank you, Marta. We could hear you pretty well. So thank you for powering through. I'm glad you mentioned trust, because I feel like that is part of the challenge of this work, is building trust with readers to say, okay, I did all this fancy math. Trust me that my conclusions are true. I thought maybe I would go to you, Brian, and talk about your validation, how you guys validate, because it sounds like you unlike Bellingcat, are not willing to just go with the picture. You seek on-the-ground validation as well.
Right. Right. So, I mean, all of our currency is basically in being right about what we're saying, right? So if we're proven wrong about something, basically the people the governments really that we are advocating with will basically turn against anything that we say. So really being able to corroborate everything that we publish, deep fact checking. The thing is, like, anything we publish goes through 15 people doing various fact checking. So it's very difficult for us to do quick work, responsive work. Stuff takes a lot of time. And so the organization really tries to balance between the deep research that we spend months or years on, and responding to current events. But anything that we publish goes through deep programmatic and legal review. Now, I think for the For stuff like what I work on, I certainly could do a lot better with having external review, and that's something that I'm working towards as far as like kind of building an advisory council of external review of the actual kind of statistics that I put out. Part of the review that you agree with is like kind of posting your work, showing how you did your work. Long methodology sections, posting the code and the data to GitHub, but there is kind of an overlap with privacy concerns there. For example, I work a lot on policing in the U.S., so we get lots of data sets from police departments through Freedom of Information public records requests that have completely, totally detailed information about where, basically everything but somebody's name, so you could really track down people pretty easily. And these are arrests, right? So these are not, these are not people who've been convicted. So if I'm posting, kind of showing my work, both like visually, so with visualizations, I will have to, aggregate at a certain level and not show the actual kind of pinpointed raw points of where people were arrested and what they were arrested for and who they were. When I'm showing my work by showing the data itself and the code, I have to toe the line there, and I would love to be able to like just leave the raw data and allow people to push a button to go from raw data to the analyzed data, but I need to kind of consider like how much of that raw data I'm willing to share as far as privacy concerns. So like there's a balance there, and I'm not convinced that I have it 100% right, but I think it's something that we're working on and getting advice from others on.
I want to throw it to you, Logan, to talk about validation, right? Because you guys have a very different model, but you do work really hard on validating your work.
Yeah, so authentication or verification of the imagery that we collect is really important to us, of course. And for instance, for the projects we're doing to analyze civilian harm in Ukraine, we make sure that the information that we're collecting can be verified in typically multiple ways. So looking at satellite imagery, for example, after an event, you can maybe see evidence of impact scorching or a blast crater. And if that's in the same place that you previously geolocated someone's social media post of the aftermath of a missile strike, then that is a second source of information that shows the same conclusion. And that lets you be pretty confident that that is an accurate assessment of the location of what happened and the incident itself.
And do you worry about faked evidence? I feel like there's definitely, deep fakes out there. So far, I feel like they haven't been that convincing. But there's definitely been lots of attempts, it seems like, even in Ukraine, to make things seem like what they aren't. And so is there a threshold of what you're willing to authenticate? And like, what does that look like? Is it, just who makes the call?
Well, when we talk about faked evidence, what we most frequently see is actually not something like deep fakes or really intricately modified imagery, but instead something like an image from 2014 being used as though it was an image from 2021. And that can be discovered by referencing historical imagery. We also frequently see images that are just misdescribed, especially by the Russian state, as something that they're not. And again, this is frequently, you can prove that it's not what it is by finding other examples of the same type of, for instance, missile strike. You can just look at the image rather than reading the description of what it is. And I think that these very simple kind of misinformation techniques are 90% of what we see, and with a relatively small amount of these traditional validation techniques like geolocation and chronolocation, you can disprove it relatively easily.
Sorry to be just harping on you, but one of the other things that's unique about Bellingcat, I think, versus the other three groups here is the reliance on crowdsourcing and citizen journalists. And so I also wonder about whether you worry about people infiltrating and providing incorrect information.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really great about Bellingcat's techniques and our reliance on looking at the images themselves to validate the content that's within them, is frequently we don't trust the source of the images. You know, an image could be posted by a radical far-right movement, or an image could be posted by an American police department or the Azov battalion, or these relatively untrustworthy groups that have their own motivations for publishing an image. But if you use the image itself as the source of truth rather than the context around it, you can extract information from it that's useful for an investigation without having to trust where the image came from. If you can prove that it was taken at the time that it claims it was, or that it wasn't, if you can show that it was taken in the year that you're trying to look at and in the place that you can cross-reference with satellite imagery, you don't need to trust anything other than the image itself. Of course, images can be photoshopped or manipulated, but those are frequently detectable as well using forensic image analysis techniques by looking at how the noise in the image is distributed. When you take a photograph with a digital camera, the camera has some inherent noise property or grain in the image, and if you Photoshop that or alter it, it alters the grain of the image. And this may not be visible directly with your eye, but by using forensic image analysis software, you can discover these modifications and have more evidence that an image, maybe even with geolocation, isn't trustworthy, or is.
It's so funny because that is so against what I've been taught as a journalist, right? So, one of the challenges of journalism is, if you get a document, somebody sends a document in the mail, or you get it through a secure drop server or something, and you don't know who it's from, it's actually very hard to go forward because you have to validate the source of the documents. I mean, this is sort of like the Snowden files. I think if Snowden hadn't come forward, the people who had them the only way they would have been able to verify they were true was to call the NSA and say, are they true? And I think the NSA might not have confirmed it if this guy hadn't gone on camera and said, yeah, I gave them all to these people. And so the traditional way I've been taught as a journalist is that you have to know the source, you have to know their motivation, and factor that into your analysis of the document. And so, and I'm not saying that's correct, I'm just saying that's how I've been raised, and then I still do this data analysis, but the idea of just going with the photo still makes me feel a little like queasy. I have a question from the audience. Rachel, thank you for your question, which is a good one. Do you see your work as not just journalism and activism, but something that will transition to be part of the justice process, such as a war crimes tribunal? And if so, how do you treat it differently as a result? Do you want to start, John?
Sure. We do work very deeply with international justice courts at the ICC and elsewhere. I think one of the things, we're not gathering evidence ourselves using like kind of chain of custody type forensic work. But we're working with the people who are doing that and advocating for it. You know, for instance, in outside of Kiev right now, really calling for these mass graves and other locations to be handled in a forensic way, so that this evidence can be used in court later. So we definitely see ourselves as part of this when we're publishing on Ukraine, for instance. We are publishing with the mind that there will be an accountability process. It might take years, but that's what we're seeking to achieve for sure.
And Logan, I think Bellingcat has an explicit mandate to try to serve as evidence in War Crimes Tribunal. How does that change what you collect and how you handle it?
Yeah, justice and accountability is indeed one of our mandates, but sometimes that's in conflict with our role as a media organization that publishes investigations. And for instance, what we've set up in our work into identifying civilian casualty incidents in Ukraine is 2 separate processes, and in fact 2 totally separate teams. So one of our teams is focused on finding these incidents after they've been identified and turning it into an investigative report that can be published either on our website or in collaboration with other newsrooms, which is something we frequently do. And we have an entirely different team that takes that information, including maybe the location that was found by the media research team, and validates it independently, works with it independently, stores it independently, and that team then can use that and work with justice and accountability organizations, international criminal courts, in an independent way from our media organization, so that we can both keep our reporting independent from the justice process and make sure that the evidence we're providing to the justice process is independent from anything we're doing in our reporting.
That raises such an interesting question about, which was part of this question, which is it journalism, is it activism? And like, what I like is you just set up both. And that is sort of, I don't know how many people know this, but Consumer Reports is very similar that way. They have their publication, but also an activism arm that really lobbies for change and regulation. And I personally wonder if the model going forward for journalism is going to be increasingly in that direction, because journalism is under fire, and we are the people who hold power to account, and there's a lot of rising authoritarianism that does not want power to be held to account. And so there's a debate going on in the US very strongly right now, is like, should journalists just declare they are for democracy, which feels to me like a no-brainer, but is actually being debated. And so already we're in this position where it's like, okay, at what point is it just being an activist? And what I enjoy is these organizations that have already figured it out, like Bellingcat and Consumer Reports, have just owned that space. At the Markup, I come from a traditional background. I worked at the Wall Street Journal for 14 years. That is very uncomfortable for me, because I've been taught, forever to just be a witness and don't have any opinions. But of course, I have enormous amounts of opinions about everything, and so I'm really interested in this model of how you can try to serve both roles. And I thought maybe I'd open it to Marta, because they've been pioneering this joint media and activism for a long time.
Yeah, you've really put your finger on something, and Julia, you and I have had this conversation as well, so I know your level of discomfort with it, and we wear it to work every day, because, and you used the word opinion, and I wanted to pivot from that word and say, I think one of the things that has built up so much trust for our investigations is that we have really adhered to the evidence-based, science-driven nature of it, right? You're right, we all have opinions, but what is the data showing you? And what data are you missing, perhaps, that is being shrouded in secrecy by the lack of checks and balances or watchdogs. And so I would just give us two things to think about. In terms of the pressures on us, I would say something Brian mentioned earlier about that rigor takes time. And the pressure as a investigative journalistic enterprise is to get that story out, is to respond in the moment. And sometimes that's difficult to do because, like Brian, you know, our power rests on our ability to use facts, inform the public, and build that trust. And then I'll say, you know, and then to the other point of, we had an example where there is an arcane law in the consumer protection books that allows manufacturers not to divulge, allows them to sort of be shrouded in secrecy if they have a product that is actually harming the public. And so when they put that data and they publish that data, they redact the names of the companies. That data was sent to us in error, and it validated one of the things that we suspected by looking at some of the data that we had access to, which was that there was a product that was an incline sleeper for infants that was resulting in deaths of those infants. Our government was not divulging that data. They threatened us once they realized that we had the data, and we published it because that was the right thing to do for this organization. We stood by that. And as a result, many things happened and many lives were saved, and those products are off the market. But you have to do both those things. And I think I don't know about your hypothesis. Is this the direction we're going in? It's provocative. We've never shied away from saying that a fair and a just marketplace is empowered by a democratic system, and we've always sort of married those two things. But you raise a lot of thought-provoking things that we just live with every day because it's who we are.
Right. Yeah, and thank you for correcting me, Marta, on opinions, because it is true that that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about advocating for change in the world based on the evidence that something is wrong in the world, right? Brian?
There's a difference between being a proud activist and being biased, right? And so I think, the way that you do that is by being really thorough and well-rounded in your methods and looking for, trying to go around any kind of issue as full 360 degrees and looking at it in every different way, giving opportunity for those that you are criticizing to feed back into it. All the work that you do to make sure that what you're publishing is bulletproof.
Yeah, at the Markup, what we do is we model our methods on a scientific method. So we basically have a hypothesis, and then we think, what data do we need to collect to prove or disprove this hypothesis, right? So for instance, I mentioned our Facebook project. Hypothesis was Facebook lies about what it's doing. True, not true, let's see. So we realized that, you could always show anecdotally that like one person had seen, an anti-vax content and they had said they were banning it, but you couldn't show it at scale. So we built a national panel that was representative, paid people to install our tool, collected this data, and so we basically always find that whenever we come up with a hypothesis that is important, we almost always have to collect the data ourselves. It doesn't usually exist already because politically, the institutions that collect data generally collect data that they want to be known in the world, right? That's why there is no national database in the US of police use of force, because no one wants to know that who has power. And so we collect that data, and then we do something similar to what scientists do, a kind of peer review. We send out our analysis and our data sets to experts in the field to ask them to review it before publication, which is pretty controversial in journalism, but is something that we don't send the news article, but we send the methodological piece. And it has been so incredibly helpful, and it does give me that feeling of confidence, of validation, authentication. And so we have this idea that we are presenting the best evidence we have, and then we always have a section called limitations, which is like, here's the things we don't know, here's the things you will never be able to figure out that could mean that we're wrong. And so we use that at the Markup in lieu of this idea of journalistic objectivity, which is the both sides, everybody gets a say, climate change is real, climate change is not real, which is not really, that's not a true understanding of the evidence out there, right? Like 95% of the evidence, 99% of the evidence is that climate change is happening, and 1% is saying there are questions about how quickly it's happening. And so, so we always want to be framing it that way instead of just like everybody gets to have a say. Do you want to jump in on this? You don't have to.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay, well, we have 3 minutes left and no more questions from the audience. So I think I would love to hear a little bit about, just as a final word, about everyone and how you guys view yourselves as in this framework of accountability and journalism. Like if there was a lens from journalism to activist and where we all see ourselves on that spectrum.
I can start. I think the idea of truth is somewhat cliche at this point, but it is a core value of what we do at Bellingcat, that we believe that there is a truth in most incidents that can be discovered. And by revealing that truth, you don't necessarily, that alone is not going to hold someone accountable, but it is a necessary first step to establish accountability. And that truth can be revealed through investigation, it can be revealed through data collection, it can be revealed by teaching someone else the methods that lets them discover a truth in their own local environment or their own reporting process. And that is what we're trying to do at Bellingcat, to seek accountability.
Brian?
Between journalism and activist. Well, I mean, I think what we share is this real belief in shedding light on the problems or issues or areas that that need that light shed. So, looking for places and issues and rights violations where attention is needed and attention is not already being given to these issues. So that does guide kind of our project selection quite often, is where can we add our strength and power to something that where we could really have a benefit for the people who we are reporting on.
And I think Marta actually already answered this very eloquently when she said that that Consumer Reports believes that their activism is on behalf of the consumer to have a strong marketplace, and that is, I think I'm paraphrasing her correctly. And since we are wrapping up, I will just finish with saying that this was a pleasure. Thank you all for sticking with us, and we will be outside if there's also questions you want to ask us in person. Thank you very much.
Was it? Yeah. Those are wrap-ups. I I know, that makes me kind of sad. Like, or is it up forward?